Modularity is when a big program is comprised of separate components that work together to make up the complete program. So instead of a big mosh pit of code squished together, code is usually structured so that different problems are solved by different chunks of code. For example, when making a calculating program, you can break the problem down into these 4 steps. Each of these can then be considered separate problems until it's time to assemble the final program. Modularity makes the code more reusable, easier to understand, and easier to trace an error when there is a problem with the code. Java implements modularity using functions. A function is a block of code defined by the user that can be ran in the code whenever the user wants. To define a function in Java, use this syntax: public static void and then your function name. This code defines a very basic function. We're calling it simply prints function. Now that we've defined the function, we can call it with a function name along with a set of brackets in the main over here. Now, when we run the program, the contents of the function is ran once, like so. We can call this function multiple times, so we can just write func and then brackets and then semicolon, and then we just do it again, and we just do it however many times we want. And this leads to function being printed out multiple times. Or we can edit the function itself to do more things, like print more lines. So we can just write system.out.println I'm a function. And now we're calling this function 3 times. So let's run this. And boom, we've got function, I'm a function, repeated 3 times. But a function can be more than just a glorified container box for code. We can also define inputs for the function and make the function output a value as well. This is analogous to functions in maths. In maths, you define an input x, and then the function spits out an output f of x. To define inputs, you add parameters into this bracket next to the function name. These are your variables that you will input whenever you call the function. You can then use these inputs inside of the function. So here, I've told it to take a number x, add 5 to it, and then print the result. So now, when I call the function, so we write f, I must define an input x inside of these brackets. So let's say we define x to be 5. And now, when I run this program, it takes my defined value 5, adds 5 to it, and then prints out 5 plus 5, which is 10. Function calls can also become values. To achieve this, you need to use the return keyword. The return keyword's job is to give function calls a value and close the function. So instead of printing 5 plus x over here, we're returning 5 plus x instead. Then, when defining the function, you need to define the data type of the return value. Remember when we defined a function using public static void? Void just meant that the function doesn't return a value. But now, by saying int, we're saying the function is returning an integer value. When I call my function down here, the function call becomes an integer, as we've returned an integer value 5 plus x. So this f of 5 actually just means 5 plus 5, which is 10. And we're going to store that into this variable result. So now we can print out this result, and that should just be 10 again. The return keyword can also be used to end function calls early, only when the return type is void. By simply saying return like this, it tells the function to terminate without returning a value. But here, we can't do that because we can't return nothing when we specified the data type to be int. So this has to be void, and we have to remove this line. Let's make an example function add. We want the function to take 2 numbers, sum them together, and then return the sum. So firstly, we can define the function add, so public static, and then we want it to return an integer value, so let's write int here, and then add, and we want it to take 2 parameters, int a and int b. And let's open the curly brackets. And now inside the function, we want to add these 2 inputs together, so let's define another variable, int c is equal to a plus b, and then we can return c. And there we go, that's it. And now what we can do is we can call the function in here, so we can call add, and let's say 5, 3. And then we can, and because this function returns an integer value, we can store the result inside of here, like this. And then we can just print results, and what we get is we get 8 over here, which is to be expected.